This is The Road Show, and I'm your host, David Warren. On today's program, we're going to discuss the contagious nature of worry. Joining us is Sissy Goff, the Director of Child and Adolescent Counseling at Daystar Counseling Ministries in Nashville. Sissy joins us from her office, also known as the Little Yellow House. And it's so good to have you on the program, Sissy Goff.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be with y'all.
Well, as we get started, why don't we clue in our listeners, what is the Little Yellow House and what happens there?
Well, it is a really sweet place where I have had the great privilege of counseling kids and families for 30 years, which I can't even believe. It's been that long, but we have 13 humans on staff, counselors at Daystar, and we have 5 dogs, which are many kids' favorite therapists on our staff. And we see kids from about 6 up through 18 there. We do a lot of work with parents and just trying to bring hope to as many folks that are struggling in this day and time as we can.
People may remember my interview a few months ago with your friend and coworker, David Thomas. We talked about his book, Raising Emotionally Strong Boys, and today we're going to talk about your new book called The Worry-Free Parent. And you mentioned that you have been counseling children and adolescents for 30 years now. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And, you spent a lot of time before that getting educated and earning the letters LPC-MHSP. Tell us what those letters stand for, Sissy.
Well, that's a great question. I hope I can remember. Licensed Professional Counselor, Mental Health Service Provider, which just means I went to grad school and took a lot of tests.
Well, as I mentioned, you're here today on the program to talk about your new book, The Worry-Free Parent. It's sort of a follow-up to your bestseller, Raising Worry-Free Girls. And before we dive into the new book, why do you think that out of your 13 books, the book you wrote on Raising Worry-Free Girls is your number one seller so far?
Well, because anxiety is honestly an epidemic in our world today. I mean, we are looking at 1 in 4 children, 1 in 3 adolescents. Girls are twice as likely to deal with it as boys. And then the new book, which we can come back to that, but it's 1 in 3 grown-ups, with women twice as likely. But because I've been counseling girls all these years, I just was seeing the numbers rise and rise and rise and felt like there are a lot of kids who don't have access to great counseling. Their parents aren't really sure if that's what they need. And so I wanted to write a book that basically was kind of the first 6 weeks of counseling that parents could help their kids work through to hopefully start to change some of the statistics.
And I want to interject at the front end of our time together, Sissy, that your new book, The Worry-Free Parent, is not about not worrying about your children and their lives. It's about not passing on your worries as parents to your children. Do I have that correctly?
That is exactly right. Yes, thank you for saying that. This is really the first book I've written for the parents about their own journey, because I'm worried about parents' level of worry these days.
Tell us about your aha moment when you discovered that there is a correlation between anxiety among your clients, who are children and adolescents, and their parents.
I really hear the stories every single day where parents will say, I was watching my daughter or my son ramp up and get more and more anxious and more angry, which we can talk about that correlation too. And parents will say, all of a sudden I jumped in right with them and I was in the same place. And I think I knew intuitively there was something that happened like that. But then doing the research, if as a parent you have anxiety, your kids are 7 times more likely to deal with it themselves. And some of that is from a genetic standpoint, and some of it is parenting strategies that I think often really well-intentioned parents have no idea that are rippling over.
One of the things I've heard you say multiple times, Sissy, is I have never met an anxious child who didn't have at least one anxious parent, sometimes 2.
Yes, exactly. And from a statistical standpoint, there's often an anxious parent and a non-anxious parent. And research says the non-anxious parent often gets dismissed.
How are children catching their parents' anxiety? How is it getting passed on? Is it words they're hearing as children and adolescents? Is it the actions they're witnessing with their eyes, maybe body language? How are children inheriting the worries of their parents?
Yes, and yes. That was great.
Okay.
You said it. It's all of those things. I mean, definitely genetics, but also, if you think about, no one ever had to tell you or me to be afraid of snakes. But my guess is we were around some grown-up in the presence of a snake, and the parent reacted. And we all of a sudden learned these are something I need to be afraid of. And so I think it's the response that parents have. So in the Worry-Free Girls book, I came up with a definition that anxiety is an overestimation of the problem and an underestimation of themselves. So anxious kids feel like it's too big, I'm too small, I can't handle it. And interestingly enough, the two most common parenting strategies in light of anxiety are escape and avoidance. So, of course, as a good parent, it feels like good parenting when my child comes upon something stressful that is causing them a good amount of distress, for me to pull them out of it. But when I rescue them in that way, I'm basically affirming that definition. You're right, it is too big and you're too small, without ever intending to. But I think that's really one of the biggest ways is when we rescue kids, that we're making the problem worse rather than better.
You mentioned snakes, being afraid of snakes, and like maybe passing on that fear. When I was growing up, my father always discouraged me from ever getting on a motorcycle, because of how unsafe they are. And I'm sure that's another debate for another day. But I, as an adult, I have always shied away from, not only getting on a motorcycle, but getting on a scooter or even one of those little, sidewalk scooters. I've just had that kind of anxiety about that, because I was thinking about this, about what worries did I inherit from my parents? Do you recommend that parents do that and think about where they inherited their worries from?
Absolutely. I love that you brought that up. And I have a workbook that goes along with the book for that reason, because I think we've got to understand where our anxiety came from before we can see really how we might be inadvertently spilling over onto kids. I had an interesting experience at Daystar a couple years ago where a mom brought her daughter in. Mm-hmm. And, like we were talking about, Daystar is about as warm and engaging as it can possibly be. For a child to come in, it's this cute house. Our offices look like living rooms. We have popcorn popping in the kitchen. And I know when a child comes to Daystar that just the house is going to do a lot of the work of making a kid feel comfortable. And so I came down the stairs knowing that this little girl was there who was there for anxiety, and she was 7, which, by the way, is the average age of onset. And you can't see me over the radio, but I have this really enormous smile, and I smiled at the little girl, and she smiled back at me and waved at me really big, and I walked over and said, "Hey, I'm Sissy. I'm so excited that you're at Daystar. I'm going to take you on a tour of the Daystar house, and then we're going to go up to my office to meet my little dog named Lucy, who is going to love you." And this little girl popped up to follow me, and her mom grabbed her arm and stopped her and said, "Do you feel comfortable with that?" Which, her mom's bringing her to me for counseling. I would think she would feel comfortable with her daughter following me through the house. But this sweet, well-intentioned mom followed us on the whole tour, sat across from my door the whole time I was with her daughter, and I brought her daughter out when we were finished and brought the mom in, and I said, "Tell me about your family history." And just like you're saying, she said, "Well, I had anxiety when I was growing up, and my parents never understood me. And so I'm determined now to understand what's going on with her," which is what the mom was doing really to a fault. She was honestly making the anxiety worse because she was understanding it, but she wasn't helping her move toward coping strategies. And that's what kids need. That's what we need to be using in front of the kids we love.
So as a parent, would you recommend, being such a pedigreed therapist, that we do sit down and think, okay, what do I worry about? What are things that make me uncomfortable? And think, was I raised in a household where those were similar worries? And then think, the opposite way. Am I prone to passing on those same worries to my children?
Yes, I love that question. And I would suggest sitting down with a journal when you do that. I think it could be really helpful.
Do you find that specific worries are passed on, or does it tend to be an overarching sense of anxiety is passed on?
That's a good question, because part of what happens is basically if you and I were to line up a group of kids of different ages, I could almost guess what they're going to worry about the most. You know, we all have hundreds of what are considered intrusive thoughts every day. So worst case scenario thoughts, I really blew that thoughts, is my zipper up thoughts, you know, whatever they are.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're not anxious, that thought comes in and it goes right back out. If we're anxious, the thought comes in and it gets stuck. I talk about it with kids like the one loop roller coaster at the fair. And it loops around and around and around our minds. And so because of being different ages, it's going to shift as kids grow up. So a lot of younger ones, it's being away from mom or dad, something bad happening to them. They get a little bit older. I could not count the amount of kids anymore who have been to a birthday party and someone threw up. And so now when their tummy starts to feel the least bit funky, they think, oh, no, I'm going to throw up, to the point that their body gets on board and they actually get nauseated. They get a little bit older. My friends are going to think I'm annoying. And it continues to morph basically based on the things that matter the most to them at that age, okay, or the scariest thing they can imagine, which is why parents will say to me, I never had any anxiety until I had kids, because the thing that matters the most to you matters more than anything else ever has in your whole life. And so it's not really so much the subject gets passed on to kids as just the fact that we're anxious and we live in this heightened state. And the form that anxieties take is going to be based more on where any of us are in our development.
You just said about parents not saying to you that they had not ever felt anxiety until they had children. Is that they just didn't realize that they were anxious before?
I think sometimes. I mean, I spoke with a mom just this week who was type A, and if you're listening and you're type A, let me just go ahead and say we all have anxiety. But what happens is we just get really productive with it. We didn't necessarily maybe learn coping skills when we were growing up, and so we just learned to do a lot, and it made us feel better and more in control. And this mom, she didn't even realize that was what was going on. And so often, yes, we don't know that's what's at the root of some of the dread that we feel or the nagging thoughts that we have. And sometimes I think we are aware of it. And I definitely talk to parents who will say, I really wasn't anxious. And I think sometimes that's true. It just becomes more true when you have kids that you love so much.
Well, the goal of today's roadshow, and really the goal of your new book, Sissy Goff, is simple: to stop the spread of worry from parent to child and to become a worry-free family. That's the goal. I'm David Warren, your host on today's program, and when we come back, Sissy and I will discuss some other bullet points from her new book. We're going to learn how to process anxiety in healthy ways rather than passing it on. Also, we'll teach parents how to model bravery for their children and how to discover a place of deeper, freer connection to your kids. Sissy and I will both be back after this. I'm David Warren, here with some exciting news for Oasis listeners. We have a new mobile device app. It's free, easy to download, and lets you enjoy our refreshing music and talk everywhere you go. If you have an Android cell phone, go to the Google Play Store. And if you have an iPhone or iPad, visit the Apple Store and search for Oasis Radio Network. Be an Oasis ambassador and share this news with family and friends around the world. Sissy Goff is our very special guest on today's program, and she is the author of a new book called The Worry-Free Parent. And I alluded to this earlier, Sissy, but would you say that this would also work in my case without being a father, that I could learn how to be a worry-free boss?
I think that is definitely true. Yes, you can. And I mean, I feel like anxiety is so pervasive culturally right now that any of us can benefit from taking a look at what's going on inside of us and trying to do something different, because worry can dominate any of our lives and thoughts without ever intending for it to.
And we tend to pass on those worries to the people over whom we have influence, whether, in my case, employees, or in the case of parents, their children.
Yes, certainly that happens. And we don't even realize it a lot of the times when it's happening.
All right. Well, let's clear something up right now, because I thought this at first, and then I have been listening to your podcast and know better. You are not related to the author, Bob Goff, but you are related to a Bob Goff.
Yes. Isn't that funny? I'm asked that question so often. And my dad's name is Bob Goff, and my grandfather's name was Bob Goff.
Wow.
And so when people ask, I'll say, well, yes, but a different Bob Goff than you probably know. So, no, I'm not related to the author, Bob Goff, but I did get to meet him and was on his podcast recently, which was really fun.
Well, you're becoming so popular yourself, I bet he's being asked if he's related to you.
Well, that's kind. I don't know about that, but you're very kind.
Well, let's talk about another man in your life, and that is your friend and co-worker, co-podcaster, David Thomas. He was, again, my guest a while back to talk about his book, Raising Emotionally Strong Boys. And what a good guy he is, and what a great podcast team you two make.
Thank you. Well, we have been working together for 27 years, so we used to joke that we were like the Donnie Marie of parenting until parents aged out of knowing who Donnie Marie were. But we are very much like brother and sister, and I feel so grateful to get to work alongside him.
And you also mentioned a few moments ago you have another friend that works with you. This friend has 4 legs instead of 2. Tell us about your other coworker.
That is exactly right. I have a little Havanese named Lucy, who is currently 15 years old and has been working with me her entire life. And she is one of 5 dogs on staff. And so many kids are afraid to go to counseling, don't know what it's going to be like. And Lucy has this really great trick where when I hold her a certain way and I say, Lucy, wave, she'll wave at the kids. And so it just sets so many of them at ease. Plus, it's a really great gig to get to take my dog to work every day.
I love it. And I would assume that animals, pets, are very good in combating anxiety in children and also adults.
Yes. They actually release chemicals in our brain that ward off anxiety. And so we recommend, I think my favorite compliment ever is when I talk to a parent or run into someone who says, we got a dog because of you. And in fact, you may know this, David, but we were very closely connected to the Covenant School in Nashville. And we recommended, David and I went over and spoke to the parents of the students there the night after the shooting. And one of the things we talked to them about was how helpful it could be as their kids are processing all of these huge emotions to get dogs. And so I think we inspired like 20 dogs in our community, which is just such a gift and hopefully a gift to those kids as they're processing so much grief.
Sissy Goff is with me today. I'm David Warren, and we are talking about her new book, The Worry-Free Parent, and another bullet point from the book is learning how to process anxiety in healthy ways rather than passing it on to our children, or again, in my case, my employees. First of all, let's talk a little bit about awareness, that we become aware when anxiety is knocking at the door. And how will we know when that is happening, Sissy?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Dude, you have so many great questions, David. I mean, a couple of things I would say. One is I would want to know, is your thought circular or linear? Like we were talking about a minute ago, the anxious thoughts tend to loop around and around and around. And so is it looping or is it helping you move towards something productive? Because often we just get stuck in these anxious thoughts and we even think they're helping when they're not. So that would be one question. The second, I would say, is the emotion as a result of that thought bigger than the situation warrants? Because often our anxious thoughts will certainly be bigger than the situation warrants. And third, I would say, especially for parents, maybe for any of us, is your thought causing you to be progressive? So moving forward, helping your children, helping your employees develop more independence, or possessive, progressive or possessive. And in possessive, we're going to pull them close and not let them establish that independence that's really important for anxious kids or for any of us in growing as individuals.
That's what that helicopter mom did, isn't it? She became possessive of her daughter instead of progressive about letting her go and have her own growth as a little girl.
You nailed it. That is exactly right.
Another thing about anxiety is, and I get all this from you, by the way. I'm not as smart as Sissy. I just read her book. And this rang true with me. I am an A-type personality. I imagine a lot of the hosts of the programs where you're interviewed, because we kind of, are in that leadership position and tend to be this type of personality. But understanding that when you're becoming anxious, you go from vigilant to hyper vigilant. And I think I have a tendency to do that. Can you help me out, Sissy?
Yeah, it's a really thin line. And as like you're saying, as a leader in some type of job, as a leader in the community, and as a parent, vigilance is required. I mean, we have got to be paying attention to the kids that we love, to our employees. And there is a point that it crosses over into hypervigilance, where we can be consumed by thoughts, or we grow into, I always think I get really intense when I'm anxious, and I have this energy that, as you're talking about anxiety spreading, I think that energy that I can develop, I have watched it make other people anxious. I had a friend that I worked with for years. We have a little summer retreat program at Daystar, and I'm the director of it. And I had a friend who was the assistant director. And every once in a while she would say, Sissy, you're making my eye twitch. Because I just had so much intensity, and I would get so strongly into my agenda. And I think that's when, for me, I was moving to a place of hypervigilance. And so being aware, which is one of the tools that we can talk about with anxiety, being aware even of how those thoughts are registering in our body can help us know when we're moving to a place of hypervigilance.
So, like, for example, my neck feels tight, or my back feels tight, or my face turns red, or something, right? These are indicators that anxiety is coming on strong. Yes,
absolutely. Those are indicators. And that's where it starts typically, is in our bodies.
Okay, let's talk about... Now, this is very scientific, folks, but so interesting. You talk about shifting from our thoughts being in the prefrontal cortex part of our brain, which is rational thinking, over to the amygdala part of our brain, which is the fight or flight thinking. Would you break that down, give us kind of a 101 in a scientific, how does anxiety work in our brains?
Yes, I certainly will. So in calmer moments, we have blood flowing all throughout our brain, including, as you mentioned, David, going to the prefrontal cortex that helps us think rationally and manage our emotions. When we get anxious, a whole series of events in the way God has wonderfully made us, wonderfully and fearfully made us, that the blood vessels of our brain constrict, and it shifts the blood flow away from the prefrontal cortex and to the amygdala. And as you said, the amygdala is the fight or flight region of our brain, which is why parents will say to us often in our offices, my child's like a crazy person when they get to this place. Right, because the thinking part of their brain isn't even online in those moments. Mm-hmm. The thinking part of our brain isn't online in those moments. And so until we can calm our bodies back down, we cannot get to a rational place. And so no amount of trying to talk it through in the moment, if you have kids, trying to discipline your kids in the moment, none of that's going to work until we can all regulate our bodies again. And obviously, that's not to say don't discipline your kids, but I'm a huge fan of when any of us can tell our amygdala is being activated. I love a code word, and that we have a word we say like watermelon or whatever it is. And in that moment, that means we're going to pause. We're going to walk away from each other, do some deep breathing. And the way that I love to do it is to draw a square on your leg. And with each line of the square, we're going to breathe a different way. So first line, we breathe in for 4 seconds. Then we pause in the corner. Then we breathe out for 4 seconds. Pause in the corner. Breathe in for 4 seconds. Pause in the corner. And breathe out for 4 seconds. And 20 seconds of deep breathing begins the process of resetting the amygdala. That's all it takes. And so we want to calm our bodies back down and then come back and have the conversation. But we do get more and more anxious and more irrational the longer that's happening and the stronger the amygdala gets in those moments.
Okay, let's role play a little bit here with what you just taught us, Sissy. you mentioned anger, and David Thomas, your coworker and co-podcaster, and I talked a lot about this when he and I were together here on the radio on Oasis, that boys tend to act out with anger,
Yes.
And so I'm going to assume by what you've just taught us that in their brains, their physical brains, their thinking went from the prefrontal cortex over to the amygdala, and now they're acting out being all angry. Now, you have a black belt in working with girls. What do girls tend to express when it's gone from the prefrontal cortex over to the amygdala?
Well, often anger, especially with younger ages. So before they have the words to say, Mom, when you change my schedule at the last minute, which that's a huge trigger for girls, is unpredictability. And so transitions and unpredictability both. So when you change my schedule at the last minute, it makes me feel anxious. Instead of that, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, even a 3-year-old is often going to have really big emotions. Now, there is a point that I think for girls, those big emotions no longer go outward, but they go inward. And so we talk a lot about a continuum from kids being explosive to implosive. Mm-hmm. But truth be told, we could talk about it for ourselves too, that all of us fall somewhere along that continuum when we get anxious. And it may be that we get really angry, that we get strong, that we're like they tell you what to do with a bear, where you just get bigger in the face of a threat. Or it may be that we get quieter, but we walk away and are really angry at ourselves. And those are more of what are considered our imploders for kids or for us. And imploders are more perfectionistic. They feel more pressure. And a lot of times will even have anxiety that manifests in their body. So the kids are in the school nurse's office regularly with tummy aches, headaches, and you take them to the pediatrician and there's no explanation for it. Or when we have chronic illness, a lot of times it can be as a result of anxiety, and we want to be aware of that. And
interesting.
So, yes, girls can go either direction, but I think by and large, if David and I were going to overgeneralize, he would say more boys move toward explosive, and I would say more girls move toward being implosive.
Okay, so when a parent, especially, well, let's not call him a helicopter parent in this case. Let's call him or her, the dad or the mom, a caring parent.
Okay.
When their children are in this amygdala-type thinking, mm-hmm. that is not the moment to try to fix it. Do I have that correct?
You have that exactly right.
So you mentioned like a code word like watermelon, like that the family has pre-agreed upon that when this word is mentioned, that means everybody to their corner, time out, we're going to loop back later on this.
Yes, that is exactly what it means.
Okay. Now, the person with the anxiety, it's probably everybody has anxiety at this point, the kids and the parents, and that's when we can regulate our breathing. And the goal, as far as the scientific or physical goal we're trying to do, is get that thinking out of the amygdala and right back into the prefrontal cortex where there is rational thinking and we can find a solution to whatever the problem is.
Exactly. Yes. And one of the things that I think is interesting from a scientific standpoint is the more often the amygdala is activated, the more likely it is to activate. It actually enlarges and develops a hair trigger response. So I'm recommending parents, because we can retrain our brain, parents, kids, individuals, any of us, to do deep breathing exercises regularly, because we can start to shrink that amygdala if we lean towards being more anxious.
I'm so glad you said that, because I'm thinking of a loved one in my family. I will not mention names, but who kind of flies off the handle a lot and very easily. And I really don't know what to do in that situation, but just kind of stare at this person and think, what do I do? What do I do?
Well, I think it's tougher if they're your age or older. But yes, you are brilliant not to react, because if you step into it with them, then they're just going to get bigger and bigger. And so, I mean, I would honestly say, and it's part of why I want parents and kids to take a break in those moments, I would say disengaging can be really helpful, because kids, but I think some adults too, David, would rather draw you into a verbal argument to have a release of that emotion than do the hard work of healthy coping strategies. And so that's part of what I would wonder is if that person's amygdala is hyper responsive because it's enlarged, and they've gotten so used to drawing people into some type of argument or debate or something where the emotion comes out, that's become their primary coping strategy. Because the more often we use any coping strategies, the more we develop these well-worn neural pathways in our brain where they become more natural.
Okay.
And we don't even think about it.
You mentioned the pause and stop word, watermelon. You also mentioned square breathing. You walked us through that. But another part of regulating our nervous system and getting out of that amygdala anxious type thinking, you have what are called breath prayers. And I heard David and you on one of your podcasts as you were promoting this new book that we're talking about today, Sissy Goff's book, The Worry-Free Parent, available wherever books are sold, by the way. Your breath prayers, and he led us through this, and I'll just lead us through this now. Psalm 23, inhale. I will not be afraid. Exhale. For you, God, are with me. So that's a way to regulate our nervous system and try to pull back from this anxious type thought and get into the prefrontal cortex thinking of rational thinking, which is really where parents and really their children, that's really where we want to be. I think most people want to, be a blessing to those with whom they are around. They don't want to be like this is what I'm trying to say, Sissy.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, let's circle back to the helicopter mom that you mentioned earlier. Were you able to help her recognize that the reason most likely her daughter was there to see you was because of some of the things the daughter was inheriting from that mom?
Well, that one mom, you mean that wasn't? Yes. So I didn't end up being the little girl's counselor. I was just doing the assessment. And so I am confident that the little girl's counselor helped her mom see that. But I hope I'm helping a lot of parents see that in a really gracious way in this book, because we need to change the game for kids, and we're not going to be able to unless we start with ourselves.
Yeah, you say the best thing you can do for your kids is to do your own worry work. And I've heard you liken it to being on an airplane and putting your own oxygen mask on first, learning how to regulate your nervous system and the things you worry about so that they are not passed on to your kids. Well, I'm David Warren, and I'm talking with the incomparable Sissy Goff about her new book, The Worry-Free Parent. Again, this book is available wherever books are sold, and the audiobook is out now. And I was peeking on Audible earlier this morning at your other books, and if I saw it correctly, this is the first one you've read. Is that correct?
It is, yes. I loved getting to do it. I was so honored and excited.
All right. When we come back, we're going to talk about how parents can model bravery for their children. Sissy and I will both be back after this.
The Road Show is a listener favorite which airs each weekday here on the Oasis Radio Network starting at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Central. The Road Show also has a great section on our website, oasisnetwork.org. There you'll find audio archives of select past interviews, plus guest lineup and contact information, and links to our Roadshow sponsors and its host. So join us for the Roadshow, whether on your radio, computer, or mobile device at oasisnetwork.org.
Here's a little bit about today's guest, Sissy Goff. She is the Director of Child and Adolescent Counseling at Daystar Counseling Ministries in Nashville. She is the author of 13 books, including the best-selling Raising Worry-Free Girls. She speaks across the country at parenting events and co-hosts the chart-topping podcast, Raising Boys and Girls, with co-worker and our friend from before on the Road Show, David Thomas. And are you guys having too much fun doing this podcast together?
We are having so much fun doing this podcast together. Yeah, I should ask you, we have a favorite question we ask people. Can I ask you our favorite question?
Sure.
Okay, tell me, well, first of all, queso or guac?
Guac, 100%.
Okay, good choice. I love it. And what's your favorite taco?
Taco?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you're going to find this strange, but there's a new taco place in Tulsa nearby where I live, and they have, it's always corn tortillas because I love Latin America, and you just don't use the word flour when you're referring to a tortilla around a Latino. So corn tortilla, and they have a grilled salmon.
Ooh.
And it's got, like some relish or something on it, maybe some mango or something. And I think that's my favorite taco currently.
That sounds amazing.
Well, what's your favorite taco? You've got me interested now.
Well, I have a favorite taco currently, and it is from a place that some dear friends of ours that we had on the podcast on National Taco Day. They have a fascinating story, Gabe and Keely Scott, and they have a taco that's just a chicken taco with a little bit of red onion and some salsa verde, and I don't know, something about that taco. Corn tortilla, of course, that they make in-house, but it just gets me. It's my favorite one currently.
See, corn tortilla.
That's right. I'm a big corn tortilla girl.
Well, Sissy, we're talking about your new book, The Worry-Free Parent, and as we get to our next bullet point here, let me read a quote by you. To work through our anxiety, we have to do the things that make us anxious. And this takes us to the bullet point of parents modeling bravery. Let's talk about that.
Yes. David says, which I love his quote, that kids learn more from observation than information. And so we can talk to them about tools, but I think most of us grew up with parents who didn't have a great understanding of an emotional vocabulary, didn't talk about feelings, didn't know how to model healthy coping strategies in front of us. And I can't even fathom what it would have been like to have had a conversation with my mom or dad. And in fact, I just had a mom and daughter sitting in my office, and the mom was doing a beautiful job with this. And one of the first things I do with kids who worry is have them give their worry a name. And this little girl, sometimes we'll call it the worry monster or the worry bug because it tries to bug them with these anxious thoughts. And this girl named hers Bob, which I have no idea why she picked the name Bob, but I loved it. And her mom was sitting, the three of us were talking, and her mom said to her, Bob has been bothering me a lot. And I told him to shut his mouth and leave me alone. And the little girl's face, she smiled so big because I think to feel like my hero, the person I trust most in the world, has worries too, which means it's not that something is wrong with me, which is often kids' default. And she's working through them, so I can too. I believe in myself like she does.
Yeah, you're basically talking about we don't have to hide our worries from our children. Now, I can hear people pushing back on that in my head right now as they're listening.
Yes.
Do you want to explain that? Of course, we don't want to overwhelm our children, but we want to model that you worry as my young daughter or young son, but so does mom and dad. We worry too, but here's how we handle it.
I'm so glad you made that distinction. Yes. I believe there's a difference in sharing our feelings with the kids we love and processing our feelings with the kids we love. And processing would be more like, I was so worried today, and I didn't know what I was going to do when I had to make a presentation at work, and I got so nervous, and I felt like I was just such a failure. That's processing, where we're sharing every detail. But sharing our feelings would be more like, I had to give this presentation at work, and I felt nervous, and it was fun. It went great, and there was no reason for me to get as worried, where we're just more sharing it for them rather than for us. And with kids, I think they need to hear, as grown-ups, either that we were okay in that or we're going to be okay. They need that reassurance. And we could talk about that even if we were talking about parents getting divorced or grieving as a family, that it is completely appropriate and healthy for kids to hear their mom or dad say, I'm really sad, or I've been having a hard time, but honey, I'm going to be okay. And I want you to know it's okay that you can be sad, and you're going to be okay too. And I'm still your mom, and I'm going to take care of you, or I'm still your dad, and I can help you work through this. Where they don't, I think if we are really processing with them, I think sometimes kids will feel like they have to rise up and take care of us and end up shutting down their emotions to do so.
Since today's theme, Sissy, is about not passing on our worries to our children, let's mention that not only could you share, like, I was really nervous when I had to give a speech today, because in that way you're being transparent and showing your emotions to your children, and you made a really good distinction there. But then you could also say, but here's what I did in advance before I gave my speech or did whatever, and then talk about the tools, some of the things we've mentioned earlier during today's conversation, to kind of model how the parent self-regulated his or her worry for the child.
Yes. I think that's so smart. And it's true. I mean, I can't even think about how often I'm about to go give a presentation somewhere and I start to get nervous and I have to regulate my own breathing, or I get frustrated and do the same thing, that I just have to take 3 deep breaths. And so to say to kids, I had to do some square breathing myself, or I did some breath prayers, or one of my other favorite things when we're stuck in a loop are called grounding techniques. And they're basically cognitive behavioral therapy techniques that once we've done the deep breathing, our bodies are capable of getting out of the loop, but we're not quite there yet. So we've got to shift our focus to something different. And anything sensory related, like our 5 senses, is what's considered grounding. So anxiety resides in the past and the future. So when we're anxious, we kind of spun off, and we need something to pull us back to the ground. And that's what a grounding technique does. So my favorite one is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we can do this ourselves. We can do it with the kids we love and say, hey, tell me 5 things you see right now. Tell me 4 things you hear. Tell me 3 things you feel, not emotionally, but from a tactile sense. Tell me 2 things you smell. Tell me 1 thing you taste. And if you or I were to do that right now, especially the smell and the taste require a lot of focus. And so they pull us out of that loop. And so that's where I would want to go next. And then probably the third tool I would use with kids is, sometimes we talk about it like the old fire safety model of stop, drop, and roll, but stop, drop, and flip the thought. Mm-hmm. So stopping would be stopping the progression of anxiety by doing the breathing. Dropping would be shifting to something else, like I'm going to focus on 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And flipping it would be just flipping the thought to something more positive. And I had a group of kids talk about this last week that they said, I try to think the opposite rather than I failed this quiz, to think I have a really good grade in this class. And so even if I didn't do as well on that quiz, maybe it would lower my grade a couple points, but I'm going to be okay. So flipping whatever the thought is can help us shift the worry too.
And do you suggest that we face specific fears, that we model that for our children if we are parents? Like, for example, snakes, getting on a motorcycle or maybe a scooter, giving a speech, whatever. In other words, showing them that sometimes we have to face our fears and do the thing that makes us afraid because it takes away its power at that point.
Exactly. Yes. The truth is none of us are going to work through anything we're afraid of unless we are in the presence of the thing that makes us afraid or do the thing that makes us afraid, kids included. And so, yes, I think that is brilliant to talk with kids about how we go ahead and face our fears. And I think with us, with kids, we do that really gradually. If you cannot get your child out of your bed, you start with having them sleep on a pallet on the floor next to you, and then you move them into the hallway outside of your room, and then you gradually move them towards their own bed for a certain period of nights. But we're going to step into it rather than just jumping into the scariest thing.
Hey, before we take our final break, Sissy, are you willing to tell us about a time that you faced a fear or a worry?
Ooh, yes. Well, I can think of a lot of fears. Mine probably has progressively had more to do with public speaking or doing publicity kinds of things.
Hard to believe.
Because I tend to do that a lot in my life. What'd you say?
That's hard to believe, by the way.
Oh, well, no, certainly. And so my most recent big fear was I was on GMA 3. And, sitting in that chair right before I talked, I was doing deep breathing. I had to regulate my body because I knew I wouldn't do as well. And I think none of us do on whatever we're trying to do unless I could get my body calm back down. So I was doing it just a month ago, right before I did that interview.
Well, Sissy Goff has been our very special guest. We're going to take one final break and be back with some final minutes with Sissy, but let me mention that she is the author of this book we've been talking about today, The Worry-Free Parent. Here's the subtitle, Living in Confidence So Your Kids Can Too. And this book is available wherever books are sold. Sissy is spelled S-I-S-S-Y, Goff, G-O-F-F. Again, the name of the book, The Worry-Free Parent. You can also find it on audible.com. And Sissy reads it and does a fantastic job of it. I also want to mention one more thing, and this is what we will spend our final moments on, and that is an accompanying workbook for adults, for the parents. And we can think of it as continuing education. We'll talk about that right after this. I'm David Warren, Program Director at Oasis Radio Network and one of the hosts of this podcast. All of our hosts enjoy hearing from you, our listening family, so drop us a note. Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and you'll receive new episodes on your mobile devices. And now, back to the show. Well, we've been talking about learning how to live in confidence so our kids can too, and that's the subtitle of Sissy Goff's new book, The Worry-Free Parent, available wherever books are sold, also the audiobook on audible.com, and there's a workbook. You don't just end at the end of the book, you're just getting started because there is the workbook. And tell us how you envision adults, parents using this, and of course I'm an adult and I could use these same concepts as a leader.
Well, I hope you could, and my intention was really for this. We do a lot of what are called parent consults at Daystar, so sitting with parents and talking through what's going on with my child, what can I do to help, and my intention with the book and the workbook was for it to really feel like a parent consult. And so it's a lot of the questions I would ask a parent or an adult if they were sitting in my office, and prompts I would give them of things to think through that I think, you know, when we're reading, often we're digesting the material, but we're a little bit more passive than stopping and thinking through, now really, do I see this? How do I see this in myself? And I was hoping that the workbook would give parents, grown-ups, an opportunity to stop and look and think and write some about their own journey and about who they want to be as parents, because I think often anxiety keeps any of us, not just parents, it keeps any of us from being who we want to be in the world. And that is certainly not what I want anyone to experience, and I don't think we have to.
Hey, Sissy, I want to end with kind of a bold, maybe a tough question for you, but if I as a parent think my child could really use some therapy, is that a sign that I, as the parent, could use some therapy?
That's a really good question. I would say, I mean, I think therapy can be great for any of us.
I agree.
But I think as a parent, I would suggest taking your child in and maybe saying to the counselor, hey, I'm really open, and I would be willing to go if you think me doing my own work would be helpful for them. But likely, if your child is anxious, let me just go ahead and say yes. I think it'd be helpful.
Okay. And don't you think that your workbook would be a good starting point if somebody does not have a therapist?
Yes, I would certainly hope so.
All right. Where can we get the workbook?
Anywhere books are sold or through Amazon.
All right. Sissy Goff, The Worry-Free Parent, both the book, the audiobook, and then the accompanying workbook are available. And so, folks, here's some great information for you. You know what to do at this point. Sissy, tell us your website, if you would.
Yes, it's raisingboysandgirls.com.
Raisingboysandgirls.com, and put in a plug for that wonderful podcast you and David Thomas do.
We have a podcast called Raising Boys and Girls that we have a lot of fun with, and we also try to be really active on Instagram to help at Raising Boys and Girls and Sissy Goff, both places.
Sissy, thank you so much for your time. You have done a lot of these interviews to promote your new book, and I'm so glad you said yes to the Oasis Radio Network, and I was really excited about this. You can tell I'm passionate about this subject, and I like to tell therapists whom I interview that I think I'm just a frustrated therapist wannabe, just to be honest here. But God has placed me in radio, so I'm glad I'm here to get the word out about what God has given you to do. And thank you for doing it for the kids there in Nashville and for all of your listeners around the world.
Thank you, David. You're making a lot of difference in a lot of lives, so I'm so grateful to have the time with you.
Well, thank you, Sissy. I'm going to read one more of your quotes as we say goodbye. You say, to look at your own life and deal with your own stuff is one of the best gifts you can give your children. For Sissy Goff, I'm David Warren, and it's been another great Road Show. You've been listening to The Road Show. If you'd like to write to us, here's our address. The Road Show, P.O. Box 1924, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 74101. Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. The views of today's guest aren't necessarily those of this station, but we do appreciate and thank our guest for spending this time with us. The Road Show, an Oasis Network presentation.